Hi, welcome back. So this is part two of history and policy, and obviously this is the policy part. But here's what's going on in the country. I give you this short clip of the history of conservation in the United States. And I think what I need to say right now is that conservation is using the resources and preservation is setting them aside. Now, people are thinking we need more conservation or more preservation. Do we need to protect the forest from logging? Do we need to log more? And the next thing that's happening is we're creating laws to make these decisions. And do we need more laws or less laws? So it's getting very complicated very fast. All right. So let's look at just a quick introduction, and I'll ask you a few questions at the end. The introduction to forest policy includes, first of all, the division between policies and laws. The policies are the principles, plans, and courses of action that guide the management, and the laws are how we describe or encode the regulations to achieve the objectives. So policies and laws. And policy has a major influence on social, economic, and the political structure or culture of the United States. So now we're getting divided by different people's beliefs and values, which is very important. Who makes the laws? There's four people organized to make these laws. The bureaucracy, I can't say that word. The bureaucracy are the actors, which I already taught you are divided into two branches in the federal government, the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. The society are the individual voters. Now, when something decides to come to a ballot and we have a say in it, is also controversial. So should biologists make decisions about trapping wildlife in Colorado, or should the people make those decisions? Now, industry is very involved, and you can imagine there's the forest products industry, livestock, tourism, and they have different beliefs. And natural resource professionals, such as the Society of American Foresters, which I'm going to be teaching you about, and other natural resource organizations that will actually go to Washington, D.C. and fight for what they believe in. The timber industry, of course, they are fighting for their jobs. The tourism industry is fighting for skiing in Colorado and examples like that. So we have these four areas. Again, some more history. 1841 to 1945, the natural resources become a political issue, locally, nationally, and internationally. So national sovereignty was bolstered through settlement. So now we're moving across the country. You got to see Tom Cruise with his flag and Nicole Kidman, and they're riding on a horse, and they get to stab the flag, and they get to, what's it called, homestead on 40 acres. All right, and I totally forgot the name of that movie. I'll tell you in a minute. We're also using natural resources to subsidize agriculture and education. And we're starting to transfer natural resources to private ownership because there's too much public land to manage. So national sovereignty, the idea that independent nations, which have declared their independence, were no longer being ruled by Great Britain, have an organized government, self-contained, and have a right to exist without other nations interfering. It is essentially the unspoken rule of a nation's right to exist. And at this point, we're realizing we need to create some laws to manage these resources. So here is the Declaration, Environmental International Law, that we have the right to exploit our resources, create our environmental policies, and the responsibility to do this without causing damage. So now 1841 and 1945 continued. the moral acts, 2/3 of the public domain are transferred to private lands. And by 1891, the country is largely settled. Now we have people in the government that are deciding how we're going to manage these lands. In 1872, 2 million acres set aside for Yellowstone National Park. That's preservation. 1876, we create the Division of Forestry, so we have an agency to manage the public lands. The Forest Reserve Act sets aside more land. It was created by the President of the United States, and already the conflict is forest reserves are a drag on development. We can't just do whatever we want. Gifford Pinchot was elected the first chief of the Forest Service, 1905 to 1910. The Weeks Act was created to examine and locate and recommend lands within watersheds to navigate the regulation of flows. And now the National Park Service is created to manage the national parks. At this point, forest policy governed public but not private land. In 1950s, we're seeing a huge switch. We began to deal with the management of private lands for recreation, including fishing, hiking, camping, and hunting. We create the Wilderness Act of 1964 so we can set aside 9 million acres to not be developed in any way. That has grown to 104 million acres today. And we just start managing for multiple use: wildlife, timber, recreation, range, and watershed. Unfortunately, it was difficult to balance and administer. The environmental movement creates an era of conservation. In the 1930s, it creates an era of preservation. And when we start looking at clean water and air and pollution, the third era becomes the environmental movement in the 1960s. One of the examples of the dawning of this era was Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in 1962, which wrote about the pesticides being transferred through the food chain, and Barry Commoner creating the first Earth Day in 1970. So instead of memorizing every law, there are 6 or 7 laws that I'd really like you to become aware of. And so please do the assignment, and we will review these laws later. But in closing, the environment is being discovered by the people who live in it. And by 1990, 3/4 of the people in the United States consider themselves environmentalists. Well, the question now becomes, what is an environmentalist, and how do we manage these lands?